I've got 3 days to get a video out. Let's scrap what I was working on and do an Arlecchino video. Great idea, no way it could backfire. Arlecchino is the new hotness, and I was kind of on the fence about pulling for her because different people were saying wildly different things about her, but after she pretty much confirmed my chess theory, I felt like I kind of owed her. Besides, I figured once she actually released, everyone would get on the same page. Well, that didn't happen, so I guess I'll do it myself. Arlecchino is a Pyro polearm user with some HP finagling that gives her a Pyro infusion. Sounds kind of familiar, but you'll be relieved to hear she is not Hu Tao power creep. She's Yoimiya power creep. She's a normal attacker that chases down enemies and blasts away their health bars and actually works better in AoE than single target. The chase down thing is great until the game tries to gaslight you into thinking you're attacking the wrong enemy. The reason she works better in AoE is because her skill grants her Bond of Life for every enemy it marks. The more Bond of Life you have, the more damage you do. Turns out, in single target, you mark less enemies, so you get less Bond of Life. She's still great in single target, but she turns into John Wick in AoE. So the first thing we need to know to get the most out of her is how her skill, passives, and normal attacks interact with one another. Like we already mentioned, her skill marks enemies. When you charge attack, you claim Bond of Life from them. If you wait for 5 seconds, the mark gets bigger, you get more Bond of Life when you charge attack. So, to maximize her Bond of Life, you want the skill before moving through the rest of your units and charge attack when you get back to her. Her passive also has a built-in life insurance policies for the enemies that still gives you a payout when they fade out. When she has over a certain amount of Bond of Life, she gets a Pyro infusion. One really neat thing about that is that this Pyro infusion is semi-permanent. As long as you have over 30%, she's got it. So, all y'all that like to watch the world burn will finally have something to do in Mondstadt again after all these years. The reason I say semi-permanent is because when she hits an enemy, the more Bond of Life you have, the more damage she does. But it also drains her Bond of Life. This means the longer you stay on her, the weaker she becomes. There are a few other ways to lose Bond of Life, and one of them is extremely unfortunate. We'll start with the one that's the least unfortunate, her burst. It clears all her Bond of Life and heals for an insane amount. You might think, ooh, insane heal, Farina. But Bond of Life has anti-synergy with Farina. Typically, Bond of Life takes whatever healing your character would receive and uses it to get rid of the Bond of Life. Farina requires your HP to change, and if your healing isn't changing your HP, it doesn't build fanfare. But it's worse with Arlecchino, because Arlecchino can only be healed by her burst in combat. And since her burst clears all your Bond of Life, and she relies on having Bond of Life to do damage, you'd rather burst at the end of her field time than at the beginning. So, you'd be getting those stacks after she's already done her damage. The other way to lose Bond of Life is to be healed outside of combat, which is also bad. All your healing will go into clearing the Bond of Life before it heals her. So, if you're trying to give her food, she can get full before she even gets healed. Another problem with that is that you don't want to clear her Bond of Life. It stacks. The more she has, the more damage she does. So if you're standing in Bennett's burst when you delete an enemy, say bye to all your Bond of Life. But that's all fine. Those are things that, as long as you understand why they work that way, you can use them to your advantage. Since her burst gets rid of your Bond of Life, you just don't do it unless you need heals. Just remember to skill afterward because it gets rid of your skill mark and any Bond of Life you have. It resets the skill cooldown so it won't be a problem. So, despite what you may have heard, she does not need ER. No ER means more Oonga Boonga stats, and we all love Oonga Boonga stats. Her Bond of Life being healed outside of combat, well, it couldn't do that if she didn't keep whatever Bond of Life she had at the end of combat. Because of that, you can easily stack it and max it out. The more you play her, the more effective she becomes. That's great, but there is one major issue that Hoyoverse absolutely needs to fix for her, because it is absolutely ridiculous she made it out of beta with it. When you enter a domain, it clears her bond of life. When you change to a new party, it clears her bond of life. When you enter a new abyss chamber, it clears her bond of life. That incredible bond of life stacking mechanic she has just does not work in Abyss. Please, Hoyoverse, fix this. You can edit your party and it's fine, but if she swapped for any reason, be that select screen for a domain or when you take control of a different team without her, she loses one of the coolest parts of her kit. But aside from that, she's great. So let's get into one of the best things about her, and that's her builds. It should be obvious that the new Bond of Life set is her best in slot, but that's assuming equal value between her gear. I'll let you in on a secret. Like Yanfei with Wondrous Troop from my last video, Arle is really strong with the set you've probably already leveled as off pieces. Since your off pieces can be any set, you generally just go with the best one. So if you've been playing long enough, you might already have an incredibly busted gladiator set ready to go for her. Let me tell you, I have never had a character come online this fast simply because I had some amazing glad pieces I wasn't even using on anyone. She was taking on bosses in Overworld at level 40 before I could even level her talents. It's nut. For her main stats, attack, pyro, crit. Don't even bother with EM. It's less common, so it will probably have worse stats. She doesn't even get a lot of reactions because her normal attacks have standard ICD, and it's almost useless in her non-vape teams. For instance, Overload. It's always been underrated as a reaction because people just didn't understand that transformative reactions pretty much require full EM investment to come online. For characters like Arle, you lose a lot more than you gain by trying to build for the reaction. The same goes for the new Burning set. Chevreuse and the Burning set aren't there to buff those reactions, they're there to buff the attacks that cause them. For her weapons, just whichever polearm gives you the most stats and balances your ratio. Her weapons passive doesn't even work on anyone else, at least right now, so the only reason to even consider it is the drip. I've got her on a Jadewing Spear because when there's a chance for me to get a weapon on Standard Banner, there's a guarantee I'll get a weapon on Standard Banner. But most polearms are really strong. Even Vortex Vanquisher, a weapon you probably have to look up to remember what it does, is a great option if you can balance her ratio without a crit weapon and run her with the shield, which isn't a bad idea, but not nearly as necessary as some people might be leading you to believe. If you don't have a 5-star stat stick, either Battle Pass weapon, people are really sleeping on Battle of Fjords, though I still won't recommend spending, only consider them options if you already have them, but they are both great. Your attack percent and weapons are still strong, and even Blackcliff if you've got some Star Glitter saved up. I've heard White Tassel recommended, but considering its extremely low base attack and that Arlecchino wants all the attack, I wouldn't go scrambling for Chest and Chinyu Veil just to be like, look guys, she has a 3-star weapon and still blows things up. Speaking of why she wants all the attack, let's take a look at these passives. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other character that has 3 combat passives. And this third passive of Arle is not getting enough attention. This 20% resistance is actually kinda nutty. Resistance is an independent multiplier. 20% resistant is just 20% less damage taken. She has slightly higher than average defense, which is another standalone multiplier, and the 17th highest base HP. All things considered, that makes her one of the tankiest characters in the game. It just might not feel that way because you aren't getting the periodic heals you're used to. Onto her talent priority, normal attacks. Unlike other characters whose skills buff them, None of the scaling on her normal attacks is improved by her skill. Those units still prioritize their normal attacks despite the fact that talent levels on their skills increase them too. So Arlecchino's normal attacks are on an even higher priority than theirs. You could honestly get away with not leveling her skill or burst at all, but extra damage is extra damage. So I'd still recommend leveling them, but only after you've boosted her normal attacks as high as you can. It is pretty convenient though that the healing from her burst doesn't scale with talent levels at all. Constellations. Always give a character a fair shot before pulling for cons or weapons for them. You can't make an informed decision about an improvement if you don't understand what it's improving. In Genshin, if you get a full grasp of what the limited character does and what to expect from them, you'll almost always realize that those improvements aren't needed. This might not mean much, but I can say from experience that those improvements can even make the game less fun. I got C3 on Yelan while pulling for Lynette, and C3 on Raiden and Yoimiya while pulling for Chevreuse, and I can't be asked to even play them anymore. That said, let's talk about them. C1 gives you more Bond of Life. It doesn't matter all that much in AoE where you can max out your Bond of Life right from the start, but at C0 it can take a couple of rotations or more if you stretch her field time longer than it needs to be and waste Bond of Life you should be saving up. So in practice, it's mostly a boost to your first and second rotation in single target. But that is where the majority of your damage is going to happen with her either way. So I'm not going to pretend it's not good, but it is definitely overhyped. Also gives interruption resistance, but you'll probably be running her with teammates that cover that for her. Z2 is nutty. A 900% multiplier once a rotation that can vape will absolutely trigger that dopamine in your brain. On top of that, she turns into Yoimiya, so you don't have to skill before moving through the other units anymore. We already talked about how underrated resistance is. Well, now you can double her max potential resistance. We're already getting into this character is no longer fun territory with this one. C3 boosts her normal attacks. We already talked about how important those are for her. C4 makes skill charge attack burst, skill charge attack viable in every rotation, and essentially lowers her burst cost to 45. So still no reason to build ER with it, but it also makes her viable with Farina. C5 is you're pulling for C6 anyway, so here's a constellation for that constellation. C6 makes Eula mains regret their life decisions and gives a better Kujosara C6 buff to Arlecchino. Alright, cool. All that out of the way, onto her teams. Obviously, you can basically plug her into any team Hu Tao or Yoimiya would fit in, and she'll do fine. And that's what most people are doing. However, you might notice that when they do that, they're using Zhongli's burst when you normally wouldn't bother with it because it takes too long. Here's the thing, despite what they might tell you about it's because the petrification is actually more useful for her, they're really doing it to cover up the fact that if you don't, when you swap the Xingqiu, his skill will still be on cooldown. You can't trick me, I know what you're up to, I see you. I still get comments from time to time that say Xingqiu's skill cooldown is too long. So let's clear that up. It's 20 seconds. That just means you put them in teams where you only need to use it every 20 seconds. It's exactly as long as it needs to be. And that's probably one of the reasons it generates so many particles. We saw the same recently with Shiori, which really got me because hers is only 16 seconds. I can't even think of a team with a rotation lower than 16 seconds. You think I'm rambling, but this is actually important. There's been a shift in Fontaine that not a lot of people have picked up on, and that's that most of these units are built around shorter rotations. When you push for the extra time on Arlet or Nuvalet or Risley or Navia or Linny, you're just extending the amount of time they're not doing their max damage. On top of that, it extends the amount of time your units are kept on energy, causing all the particles you're generating to be wasted. So instead of recommending the same Pyro on-field teams you've been seeing since 1.x, and in every Arlecchino video so far, I'm going to try to focus on teammates that give you the most out of the time you spend on field with her. But first, I'd like to talk about a teammate I can't show you because I don't have her C6, and that's Candace. Candace has kind of been overlooked because her burst doesn't last long enough for other on-fielders, and her application is a bit too fast. But with Arlecchino, you swap to her, you immediately get an instance of Hydro when she switches in, another hit on her first normal attack, and then what should be enough Hydro to vape her vapable hits, in addition to a buff to those normal attacks. On top of that, Candace's HP scaling damage hits really hard and is AoE. At least on paper, she seems like the perfect character to use right before you swap to Arle to take advantage of her AoE, slow Pyro app, and the tighter rotations she can do. Now onto things I can show you. Starting with Chevreuse. Chevreuse is an excellent teammate for Arlecchino, and not just in Overload. Can't stress this enough, but Chevreuse's attack buff and C6 do not require her to be run with only Pyro and Electro teammates. You can run a Hydro and still get them. You can still get her C6 without even having an Electro. With an Overvape team, you're locked out of a Res Shred, but you know what team normally doesn't have Res Shred to begin with? Friggin' Overvape. Never heard anyone complain about not having Res Shred in Riding National, so it's a little weird to claim you can't play her in Overvape because you can't get her Res Shred anymore. Y'all been playing Overvape without it for years. Why is it just now a problem? Like I mentioned, you can even play her with Chevreuse in Mono Pyro if you want Arlecchino to be the only character doing damage, because her C6 still works. Despite saying when a party member is healed, Chevreuse's skill can still tick when you can't be healed, like when you're at full HP, and it still triggers her C6. Another notable teammate, and y'all should have seen this one coming, Bennett. She loves stats, and Bennett gives them to her. Though, if you don't have C1, he will not buff her when she is below 70%, and cannot heal her back above it. In addition to the stats though, you pair him with Chevreuse and you've got yourself a really strong core. You can add an Animo unit like Kazuha or Lynette to provide grouping, buffs, and Res Shred. If you don't have her C6 though, you'll definitely want your last slot to be Electro. You can add a Hydro like Candace, who I've already mentioned, or even, and y'all are gonna call me crazy, Nilou. Turns out she applies enough Hydro to vape Arlecchino, and it's AoE. Not the best option, obviously, because she's not doing any damage, but until I get C6 Candace, it's the best I got for these faster rotations. You might be wondering about Mona. Tried it, couldn't get it to work. But I've never been able to get Mona to work, so it might just be skill issue. Other notable teammates to fit into this slot are shielders. Zhongli, Layla, Toma, Kirara. Hell, you might even have enough Pyro particles to run Tank Fae comfortably. One thing I'd like to say, if you go with Kirara and you're not having any luck on Arla's Bond of Life set, Unfinished Reverie becomes better than Glad when enemies are burning. Also, you don't have to restrict yourself to Bennett. Bennett and Chevreuse are really strong together here, but you can take or leave either one. I'd recommend at least having one of them, but they're both really strong characters and you might want one of them on the other side, or maybe you just don't have both. For your Electros, Fischl, Beto, Lisa, EM Raiden, Miko, they're all great. I personally wouldn't try to get away with running Beto or Lisa without another Electro to battery them, but Beto gives damage reduction on top of Arla's resistance, and Lisa gives defense shred, so they can be totally worth it. Miko fits better into the 20-second rotation teams because of her field time. Lastly, Dehya. I know it seems like every patch someone's like, this character solved Dehya, but she actually works pretty well as your defensive option in those 20-second rotation vape teams I ignored because they've definitely heard enough about them and Arle just isn't really optimized for them. I really wanted Shinha to work for Melt, but I just couldn't crack the code. So hopefully someone smarter than me figures it out, because she's kind of growing mold in my character archive. Anyway, with all that out of the way, I'm gonna hit you with the showcase of these units in action. I'll have the rotations I'm using on screen, and I'll be going through the builds I'm using for all the characters below the clips so you can try them out for yourselves. So enjoy, and I'll be back in a bit. And there we have it. There's my Arlecchino guide done. Actually, my first guide. I put up a poll a while back asking if I should do guides or just keep up with the team building videos, and it was pretty evenly split between the two. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say about it. Thanks for hanging out. YouTube thinks you're gonna like the video on screen. If you're not subscribed, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Have a good one. Bye.